Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So today we're diving headfirst into authoritarianism. We're going to use the Trump administration, specifically from January 2025 onwards, as, well, our main case study.
Right. And we've got some interesting material to work with, analyses looking at, the impact on democratic norms.
Yeah, and even a little bit on the generational side with Gen Z, though that's less central today. Our mission really is pretty straightforward. Figure out what those core traits of authoritarianism are and see how they might be showing up in, well, modern politics.
It's a critical topic.
Definitely. Have you ever felt like, the news cycle is just relentless, throwing so much information at you, but maybe you're not quite seeing the underlying patterns?
I think a lot of people feel that way.
Well, let's try and unpack some of those today.
Sounds good. So when we talk about authoritarianism, fundamentally, we're talking about power being really concentrated.
Like at the very top.
Exactly. Think of it as a very strong central authority, and as you go down, there's less and less room for political freedoms.
Okay.
And the sources we're using, they really stress it's not just about a powerful leader. It's also about, systematically weakening those democratic checks and balances.
You mean things like elections, the courts?
Precisely. Free elections, an independent judiciary, civil society, the ability for people to actually organize and, well, speak out, these things tend to get diminished.
It makes sense that these kinds of systems don't just pop up out of nowhere. The analysis we looked at mentions historical factors, right? Like unrest or instability.
Absolutely. Social unrest, big economic problems, political turmoil. These can create an environment where, well, the appeal of a strong hand promising stability grows.
When things feel shaky, people might look for that certainty.
Exactly. And what's really striking is how similar the strategies are across different authoritarian regimes, historically speaking.
Like what kind of strategies?
Well, you often see populism, that idea of a leader connecting directly with the people, usually against some kind of elite. Then there's nationalism, a really strong focus on national identity, sometimes, defining us by excluding them.
And scapegoating, too, I imagine, blaming problems on specific groups.
Very common. Add in controlling information, maybe through censorship or propaganda, and you see this pattern. It's really the opposite of how democratic governance should work, ideally.
Which relies on transparency, the rule of law.
Right, applying rules fairly, not just arbitrary decisions from the top.
And the stakes are huge when these things start to slide. We're talking basic human rights, civil liberties, the health of democracy itself.
No question.
So, okay, let's turn to the Trump administration post-January 2025. The sources point pretty strongly to immigration policy first.
Yes, the material mentions reinstating family separation at the border, pushing for more aggressive deportations.
Tough policies.
Very. And while the administration would likely frame it in terms of, say, border security, the key thing our sources focus on is the impact and the criticism. Critics flagged serious human rights concerns, departures from established norms, legal and ethical.
And that rhetoric around it?
Yeah.
Some argued it was dehumanizing.
Yes, framing asylum seekers more as a threat than, people needing help. That was a major point of contention.
Then there's the media. The whole fake news label became almost constant, didn't it?
It really did. And what's particularly potent about that tactic now is how it taps into existing distrust some people have towards institutions.
Creates a kind of bubble.
Exactly. An echo chamber where maybe only the leader's version gets through. It bypasses those traditional checks like independent journalism trying to verify things.
So by discrediting the press,
you undermine the public's ability to get different perspectives, to make informed choices. It's a classic way to try and control the narrative.
The courts also became a real battleground, especially the push to appoint conservative judges right up to the Supreme Court.
Yes, a very concerted effort. And the long-term impact there is potentially massive.
How so?
Well, these judges interpret laws for decades. They influence everything from civil rights to the balance of power itself. So the concern raised is that strategically reshaping the judiciary like that could weaken the checks and balances.
Tilting the scales for the long run.
Potentially, yes. That's the worry expressed in the analysis.
Even the way the COVID-19 crisis was handled comes up in our sources. There was a perception, wasn't there, that economic concerns sometimes trumped public health advice.
That perception was definitely there. And it raises a pretty fundamental question about government priorities.
Like, what's the main responsibility?
In a democracy, you usually assume citizen well-being is paramount. So when crisis decisions seem to put the economy first over safety, it can make people question, the government's commitment to those core democratic values.
Okay, the material also gets into specific constitutional challenges. Executive orders, for instance, seem to generate a lot of friction.
They did. The sheer number and the scope of them hitting immigration, environment, healthcare drew criticism.
Why exactly?
The main argument was that they seemed to be bypassing Congress, the legislative process. It touches on that core idea of separation of powers.
So one branch may be getting too much power.
That was the concern. Using executive orders so broadly could be seen as sidestepping the checks and balances built into the system.
And many of these orders ended up in court, right? The travel ban is a famous example.
Absolutely. That went all the way to the Supreme Court. And these weren't just like dry legal arguments. They really exposed this tension between executive power and individual rights.
The arguments were about discrimination, weren't they? Based on nationality, religion.
Yes. Particularly potential conflicts with the First Amendment's religious freedom guarantee. These cases really tested core constitutional principles.
The sources also circle back to the media, but this time looking at actions that felt like, well, retaliation against critical journalists or outlets.
Right. And you have to consider the potential chilling effect there.
Meaning journalists might hold back.
Exactly. If media outlets fear punishment for critical stories, it could lead to self-censorship. And that means a less informed public. A free press is supposed to hold power accountable, right?
Yeah, fundamental.
So when that freedom feels threatened, it raises serious questions about the health of democracy. The legal fights around this show how we're navigating these free speech issues.
It's clear these weren't just normal political disagreements. They hit on really basic questions about power and rights. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to another tactic, often linked with authoritarianism. Propaganda and media manipulation.
A classic tool. Controlling the narrative has always been key for authoritarian leaders trying to hold on to power.
And in this case, social media played a huge role. Twitter, Truth Social.
Absolutely. They offered a direct line to supporters, bypassing traditional media gatekeepers. It allowed for getting information and sometimes misinformation straight out to the public.
And that phrase, enemy of the people, directed at the press.
Yeah.
That seems very deliberate.
Oh, almost certainly. It's a strategy to delegitimize critical reporting, to erode public trust in those established journalistic sources.
So people are more likely to believe the leader's version.
That's the goal. If you discredit the referees, your claims face less scrutiny. It helps reinforce loyalty among supporters and makes it harder for different viewpoints to get traction.
The sources also mention spreading misinformation, especially on really sensitive things like COVID or election integrity.
Yes, and that deliberate blurring of fact and, unverified claims can really damage public understanding and trust.
Makes it hard to know what's real.
Exactly. And when that happens, faith can erode not just in the media, but in other institutions too. It's a common tactic to maintain control over what people think and to quiet dissent.
But it wasn't all one-sided. Our sources make a point of highlighting the public response, the resistance that sprang up.
That's crucial. There was significant pushback, and it came in many different forms.
Like the Women's March. That was huge.
Massive. It showed widespread mobilization around women's rights, social justice, political integrity. Then you had groups like Indivisible really focusing on local citizen-led action against specific policies.
And we saw big protests, too, right? Against the travel ban early on. And then later, the Black Lives Matter movement gained enormous momentum.
Absolutely. These movements really demonstrated a strong defense of democratic values, a willingness to challenge what they saw as overreach or injustice.
Social media must have played a role there, too.
Definitely. It helped connect people, amplify messages, build solidarity across different groups. And we shouldn't forget, prominent figures, former presidents like Barack Obama, commentators who spoke out forcefully for democratic principles.
It's important to see this in a wider context, too. The sources mentioned this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There was a kind of global trend.
Yes, that's a key point. If you zoom out, the style of leadership and some of the tactics weren't entirely unique to the U.S. at that time. We saw similar patterns emerging elsewhere.
Like who?
Well, the sources mention leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who systematically changed rules to consolidate his power, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, with rhetoric often attacking journalists and environmental rules.
And the analysis suggests they use similar playbooks, undermining courts, the press, playing up nationalism.
Yeah, common themes emerge: weakening independent institutions, boosting nationalistic feeling, promising law and order.
What drives that? Do the sources say, why was this happening in different places?
Often there are similar underlying factors, things like economic anxiety, deep societal divisions. Leaders can capitalize on those fears and uncertainties.
And the worry is that one leader's success kind of provides a blueprint for others.
That's the concern, yes. It can normalize certain approaches and make them seem more viable or acceptable elsewhere.
So thinking about the future, what's the lasting impact of this period on, say, American leadership and democracy itself?
It's hard to overstate the impact, really. It's definitely left a mark on the political landscape, possibly shifted norms about presidential power, and raised big questions about how resilient our institutions are.
How so?
Well, there's a concern that future leaders might feel more emboldened to use similar tactics, maybe blurring lines of accountability, testing those checks and balances.
The sources seem to frame the Trump administration as a kind of stress test for democracy, especially when things are polarized and trust is low.
I think that's a fair assessment based on the analysis. It highlights potential vulnerabilities, even in long-established democracies.
Which brings us to maybe the lessons we can learn from looking at history, at how other authoritarian regimes have operated.
Yes, history offers crucial warnings. Our sources emphasize how authoritarian leaders often exploit crises and chip away at democratic foundations.
It really underlines how vital a strong civil society is, doesn't it? Independent media, open debate, protecting dissent.
Absolutely critical. An informed, engaged public is probably the best defense against authoritarian creep.
So people understanding their rights, participating, holding leaders accountable.
Exactly. It requires constant vigilance, education, participation, fostering a culture where debate is valued. It becomes much harder for authoritarianism to take hold then. We have to keep upholding those core principles: rule of law, separation of powers.
This has been, well, a really fascinating deep dive. We've looked at authoritarianism, examined the Trump administration through that specific lens, using our source material, consider the global picture, and drawn out some key lessons.
A lot to cover.
Definitely. So thinking about everything we've discussed, the historical patterns, the recent analysis, what do you, listening right now, see as the single most vital element for protecting any democratic society from the potential slide towards authoritarianism going forward?
That's a powerful question to reflect on.
It is. This has been a deep dive into some complex and really important territory. We definitely encourage you to keep thinking about these themes and, continue exploring them on your own.